So when Darwin came up with his theory about natural selection, we actually didn't have any knowledge about how traits were passed down from one generation to the next in terms of genetics. So he lacked that piece of knowledge. He had no idea that the traits that we inherited were passed from one generation to the next. And so if he had known those things, he probably would have been able to kind of solidify his theories a little bit better with the information that he was finding as he was finding fossils and looking at the current specimens that he collected. And so we now know about DNA, and so since we do know about DNA now, we know that the changes in our genes and in our genetic code are actually inherited. So if there's some sort of mutation and it's beneficial, it will be passed on to the next generation. Or if there's a particular trait that is more favorable and allows that particular specimen to survive, it's going to survive, reproduce, and pass on that trait to the next generation, and the offspring that don't inherit that trait are not as fit, and then they are not going to survive, and they're not going to have as many offspring. And so now we can begin to see the connection between genetics and the process of natural selection. So that's what this unit is going to focus on. So one of the most important pieces of evolution is for organisms to have genetic variations. So remember that the word variation means that there are many differences. And so when we talk about variations, it's like if you look around the classroom or even around the building, you see that there are many different hair colors. There's even different shades of eye colors. There's many different heights that people grow. And so there are many variations of all these different traits. And so in this image right here, you can see that even with these kittens, that these guys are all kittens, but there's a lot of variation in their fur color, their coat color, the size of their body, the size of their tail. All of these things are variations. And that's important for evolution because it means that if there's a particular trait or a particular variation of a trait, for example, let's say that this guy right here, he's going to blend in and be able to stay away from predators more easily. And so he survives. And these other guys, they don't blend in as well with their environment. And let's say out of those three guys, let's say this guy doesn't have any offspring. Well, this guy right here, let's say maybe he ends up having 2 or 3 litters of kittens. And so ends up with a total of 50 offspring. But not all of them are going to get that light trait. Some of them will probably still get this dark trait because since these kittens here all came from the same family, they carry genes that are similar. So even though this lighter kitten here is light colored, it doesn't mean that all of its offspring are going to be light. But let's say that 25 of those 50 are light colored. They're more likely to survive and reproduce. And then all 25 of those have offspring. And the lighter colored ones are more likely to reproduce. Whereas these guys, their darker offspring are not surviving as well. Let's say only, 2 out of 3 of the darker ones survive. So this is where variation is really important. Variation means that there are traits and everybody's got fur. All of the cats have fur, all of them have different coloring, but sometimes there might be a trait that's more fit. So let's look at the example here. There can be a lot of variation in just one gene. And so if you have something like fur color here where you see lots of variation, that means there's a lot of alleles. The more genotypes, the more genetic combinations we see, usually the more alleles for that particular trait. So what that means then is that things like hair color and height we see a lot of variation with hair color and height. And so that means that since there's a lot of variation, there must be a lot of different alleles and a lot of different possible combinations. And that's going to play a role in evolution. So introducing just a little bit of vocabulary, you're going to see these words. Genes, we're always going to be talking about genes in an entire population. So we might be talking about the entire human species. And then the gene pool are all the genes that are present in that population. So if I'm talking about the gene pool for eye color, we would be looking at all the genes for eye color. So perhaps the blue allele frequency is lower than the green eye frequency allele, and then there's the brown eye color allele. And so we'd be looking at the gene pool. We look at all the genes that are present in the population. And when we talk about relative frequency, it's how often we see that particular allele. So blue eyes being a little bit less common than brown eyes, the blue allele may only have a 10% frequency in the human population. Maybe the green eye allele is, 40%, and the brown eye allele is 50%. So it's how often a particular allele occurs in that gene pool compared to the other alleles. So we're looking at all eye color alleles, but we're comparing how often one particular form, one particular allele appears versus another. So let's try a practice problem. This one gives you a little bit of a visual. First thing I want you to notice is we have 48% of the population is heterozygous for black. So these two alleles here would be a heterozygous black, this 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 would be a heterozygous black. So as I box each of them, you can see that I'm boxing two alleles because remember, you always get one from mom and one from dad. So these are all of the individuals that are heterozygous. But in this image, you can see they've got one brown allele and they have one black allele. And so when we want to figure out how often the allele for brown shows up and how often the allele for black shows up, really what you want to do is just count to begin. So if we count how many of the alleles are black, we're just counting the number of black ones. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Now this guy is our homozygous black, but we still count both of them. And this guy is a homozygous black, so we still count both of them. So we've got a total of 20 black alleles. If we count our brown alleles, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So we have a total, key here is that our total gene pool is going to be a total of 50 alleles. Okay, so the ratio of different phenotypes we would be looking at, we've got 36% homozygous brown, 16% homozygous black, and 48% heterozygous. It wants to know why is the ratio of phenotypes different than the ratio of the alleles? Well, that's because sometimes we get homozygous black, sometimes we get one of each allele, and we're still black. So even though all of these guys are black, doesn't mean that that's all black alleles. And so if we were to express the relative frequency for each of these, the relative frequency for black would be 20 out of 50, and then we multiply it by 100 to get the percentage. The frequency for brown would be 30 out of 50, and then we multiply it by 100 to get the percentage. We'll practice that more, so that's just a little introduction for you. Last keynote to keep in mind. Relative frequency, how often a gene shows up, the percentage, has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with if the trait is dominant or recessive. And evolution, here's your new definition of evolution. Evolution is any change in that relative frequency of alleles in the population. So for example, most of us have alleles for having 5 fingers on our hand. So 99% of the human population has alleles for having 5 fingers. But guess what? 6 fingers is actually the dominant trait, but it only makes up about 1% of the alleles in our entire population. So if this allele frequency were to change, if something were to make people with 6 fingers more fit, and people with 5 fingers not surviving and reproducing as often, then how often this allele shows up is going to go down, because these are not reproducing as often and they are not passing on their alleles as often, and these are. And so we see an allele frequency change. So that's what evolution really is, and that's why humans are still evolving today. Our allele frequencies are consistently changing.